Well, hello everybody, welcome and thank you for joining me. As you can see, I'm not in the old Triple T studios. I'm out camping and I'm making a separate video about where I am and everything I'll be doing here, which I'll post later on this week after I get back home and get it edited and all that. But I've got so much to talk about, more than I can really allot time for. So let me get on the high points here, because there's a couple things I really want to mention. But let me start with this. Dan Bongino, if you have not heard, has been named the Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation working directly under Kash Patel. Dan Bongino is a former Secret Service agent who has a wildly successful podcast. Dan Bongino is a good guy. He's one of the two guys Marina listens to religiously every day, and one of them ain't me. What's up with that? She listens to Steve Bannon's War Room and Dan Bongino, and I can't blame her. They're both fantastic. But Dan Bongino is transitioning in a good way to the FBI. And I would predict that a lot of people are probably shaking in their boots about this development. And I am looking at you, pencil neck geek Adam Schiff, because Dan Bongino has been talking a lot about Mr. Schiff lately and his involvement with the Russian collusion hoax that he was largely responsible for, which had a profound effect on a presidential election several years ago, as you probably know. So I think this is an encouraging development that Bongino is going to the FBI. I don't see any bad coming out of that at all. I do believe that there are some people who are going to start feeling the heat, as well they should. Now, I've got to move on because, folks, I have got to relay an article to you. This is under the byline, "Is Trump Risking His Life with Russia in Ukraine?" I want to reference an article for you by a man by the name of Jacob G. Hornberger of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is a fantastic article that I want to skim through quickly for you, because Mr. Hornberger is saying so many of the things that I've been saying recently on the show. If you want to get a sense of what President Kennedy was up against with his peace speech at American University, which he gave shortly before he was killed, just look at the reaction to President Trump's friendly overtures toward Russia the last few days. The mainstream media is up in arms over Trump's actions. Multiply that reaction by about 1,000, and you'll get a sense of what Kennedy was facing when with his attempt to move America in a similar direction. The first thing everyone should be aware of is that Russia must always be considered to be America's premier official enemy. That's because that's the principal way to justify not only the enormously large amount of taxpayer-funded largesse that flows into the defense establishment, but more importantly keeps America as a national security state rather than have its original founding governmental structure of a limited government republic restored. That's what the entire Cold War racket was all about. When the Nazis were defeated at the end of World War II, the giant military intelligence establishment that had been formed as part of the war was not about to let go of its power. Without skipping a beat, it immediately converted the old Soviet Union, i.e. Russia, from America's wartime partner and ally into America's new official enemy. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. The Reds were everywhere. North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Hollywood, the Army, the State Department, Latin America, China, Congress, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement. Some even claimed that President Eisenhower was an agent of the Reds. Through it all, the minds of Americans were imbued with the notion that it was better to be dead than red. From the first grade in the public, i.e. government schools to which their parents were forced to send them, American children received deep indoctrination in fear of the worldwide communist conspiracy to take over the world, a conspiracy that was supposedly centered in Moscow. It was an indoctrination that would last a lifetime. Then along comes John F. Kennedy, who came into office as pretty much a standard Cold Warrior, but who then achieved one of the most remarkable breakthroughs in history, beginning with the Bay of Pigs disaster, followed by Pentagon exhortations to launch a surprise nuclear attack on Russia, followed by Operation Northwoods, and followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy came to the realization that the Cold War was one great big dangerous and deadly racket, kind of like what General Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. Well, after this, that's when he committed himself to begin to bringing an end to the deep, ongoing, perpetual anti-Russian mentality with which the American people had been imbued, and many still are. It was time for America to move in a different direction, one based on peaceful, friendly coexistence with Russia. That's what JFK's peace speech at American University was all about. The speech was broadcast all across Russia. The first time that had ever happened, the Russian people were ecstatic to see the distinct possibility of friendly relations between the two nations. I couldn't help but to think about when I read an article yesterday in the New York Times about a similar reaction among Russian citizens to the possibility of a normalization of relations between Russia and the United States. As detailed in our book, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated, by Douglas Horne, who served on the staff of the Assassinations Record Review Board. It was Kennedy's decision to move America in a different direction from that desired by the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA that got him killed. As a result of what the all-powerful military intelligence establishment viewed as weakness, incompetence, naivete, treason, and cowardice, Kennedy had become a grave threat to national security and therefore had to be removed from power before it was too late. After the Pentagon/CIA regime change operation in Dallas, everything was restored to normal. The Russians and the Reds were once again America's premier official enemy. They were still coming to get us. The Vietnam War got ramped up to keep the dominoes from falling. 58,000 American soldiers were sacrificed for nothing. The indoctrination in the public schools continued. Americans continued hating and fearing Russia. Then came the great big unexpected shock when the Russians suddenly brought an end to the Cold War from 1989 to 1991. Everyone had figured out that the Cold War racket, along with the anti-Russian indoctrination, would go on forever. The defense industry went into a panic. Suddenly, people were talking about a peace dividend, which meant a drastic reduction in military intelligence spending, a possibility that Trump himself recently mentioned. No one was yet talking about a total dismantling of the national security state and a restoration of a limited government republic, but that almost certainly would have started entering people's minds before too long. The Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA embarked on a desperate search for a new official enemy to replace Russia. One of the big things they mentioned was the drug war, which is precisely what they are doing today. That's why the military and the CIA are becoming so embroiled in Mexico to justify their existence. For 11 years, the national security establishment made Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein America's new official enemy. Saddam is coming. Saddam is coming. He's going to hit us with WMDs, just like Russia was going to do during the Cold War. But as scared as Americans became of Saddam, it just wasn't the same as having Russia as the big official bugaboo. And then the 9/11 attacks occurred as a retaliation for the killings that the Pentagon and the CIA were wreaking in the Middle East. The national security establishment was off to the races again, this time with a new official enemy, terrorism. And to a certain extent, Muslims and Islam. The terrorists are coming. The terrorists are coming. The centuries-old quest to establish a worldwide Islamic caliphate is upon us. Sharia law, the USA Patriot Act, mass secret surveillance. Don't be scared, we're keeping you safe. But the national security establishment was never willing to let go of Russia as America's premier official enemy. The anti-Russia animus had been a big perpetual cash cow for the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, and their ever-growing army of well-heeled defense contractors. Thus, they began using NATO, the old Cold War dinosaur that had remained in existence after the end of the Cold War, to restore Russia to its proper place as America's premier official enemy. While NATO should have been put out to pasture with the end of the Cold War, it was instead used to begin absorbing former members of the Warsaw Pact in violation of express promises that U.S. officials had made to Russia not to do that. Knowing full well what Russia's reaction would be to such provocations, the Pentagon and the CIA kept NATO moving inexorably closer to Russia's border. When they finally threatened to absorb Ukraine, they were certain that Russia would invade, just as the U.S. would invade Cuba if Russia were to reinstall nuclear weapons in that nation. The U.S. provocations brought to mind National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski's confession of having provoked Russia into invading Afghanistan in 1979 to give Russia its own Vietnam. When Russia did invade Ukraine, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA had their premier official enemy back. The Russians are coming again. The Russians are coming again. The fierce anti-Russia animus was back. The Russians were going to conquer Europe and then the world sometime after they conquered Ukraine. The anti-Russia indoctrination in the public schools was restored. Everything was like it was before. The national security state was back in control, and the defense industry was back in high cotton, with tons of taxpayer-funded largesse flowing into their coffers. Ever since, the U.S. mainstream media has been exclaiming against Russia's unprovoked war of aggression, while at the same time remaining silent or supportive of the U.S. national security establishment's deadly and destructive invasion and unprovoked and undeclared war of aggression against the people of Iraq. No big deal. Thank you for your service. And then along comes Trump, who is threatening to bring an end to the renewed Cold War racket. The mainstream media, which undoubtedly is still populated by Operation Mockingbird assets of the national security establishment, is up in arms, the same way it was when Kennedy was moving America in a direction of ending the Cold War. The question is this: if Trump does attempt to move America in the same direction that JFK was moving America, will the national security establishment let him get away with it? If it does take him out, like it did with Kennedy, it will be much more difficult to hide its role, given the fact that so many Americans have figured out that they took out Kennedy for doing the same thing. But the Pentagon and the CIA also know that if they do take out Trump, there is absolutely nothing anybody can do about it, just as there was nothing anybody could do about it when they took out Kennedy. One thing is certain, though: if they do succeed in taking out Trump, the mainstream media will participate in the official cover-up as quickly and as completely as they did with the Kennedy assassination. That was Jacob Hornberger. Thank you for your patience. I had to share that with you because it is fantastic, because, as I've been saying, we have a generation of Americans who have been inculcated with this nonsense, folks. I know I keep harping about it, but it is just so important. So many Americans were raised with this anti-Russia bias. They were taught it in their schools. Many of them were taught it in their churches. That's all they ever heard. So naturally, and I can understand, naturally you just believe, well, it's got to be true. But it isn't true, as Mr. Hornberger points out here. We have been duped in America with regard to Russia, the old former communist Soviet Union. And Mr. Hornberger just laid it out beautifully in this article, and he is maintaining that because Kennedy pursued a peaceful relationship with the then, and they were communists back, that was the Soviet Union. And the security state of the United States took Kennedy out. I don't think anybody can argue with that. And he is maintaining that Trump is apparently going to pursue a similar path with Vladimir Putin. But the national security establishment, the Pentagon, of course, now we're in different hands, so hopefully things will turn out differently. But make no mistake, there's still a lot of people in government who despise Donald Trump and what he is trying to do. There's certainly plenty of people still in Congress. I talked about one yesterday, John Kennedy, who says that Putin has a black heart and he makes Jeffrey Dahmer look like Mother Teresa. That kind of sentiment is still prevalent within our government with people like John Kennedy and Lindsey Graham and many, many others who view Russia through this old, archaic lens, which simply does not apply, folks. It's a lie. It's a ruse. It is not the truth. And Trump, I believe, knows that, and that is why he is trying to pursue a different path with Putin. We just have to pray that God will protect him from harm, because the last time this was tried, it did not end well in Dallas, Texas in 1963, as you know. Please don't just swallow hook, line, and sinker everything you're taught in your schools, in your churches, in your social clubs, among your neighbors and your friends. You can't just assume, because, and it's easy, I get it. You're taught these things your whole life, and perhaps you never stop to consider, well, wait a minute, is that really true or is it not? If your mother or your father or your grandparents believed it and your teachers taught it and your preachers taught it, is it enough to say, well, it must be true? No, you got to do some digging, folks. I mean, I was raised in this environment as well by well-meaning people at home, in church, in school, everywhere, but we all believed it because we didn't know any different. That's why we have to do some digging. We have to understand not everything we're taught is above being scrutinized. That's not to say that everybody who taught us these things were bad people. They weren't. But we've got to get to the truth, folks. And sometimes the truth is something that may blow our minds. It might be something we haven't considered before. This article by Jacob Hornberger lays it out beautifully. It just lifts the lid off this big scam, this big false teaching, if you will, that Russia is always evil and they must be our bad guy, and that our entire foreign policy, our entire defense and surveillance state must have a bad guy. We have to have a bad guy. If it's not Russia, it's got to be Iraq. It's got to be Vietnam. It's got to be somebody. We can't just exist without an enemy. This is a fantastic article. I'm going to link it down below so that you can check it out for yourself. All right, let me move on because there's just so much to talk about. Is DOGE a ruse? The Department of Government Efficiency, headed up by Elon Musk, as you know, is ostensibly going through government, the American government, looking for fraud, abuse, and waste. And of course, that's a really good thing. I certainly applaud that, any effort to cut waste. But are things really changing, folks? You hear these stories about us spending money here and there, and Elon is exposing these things, as Rand Paul has been doing for years, by the way. And action is supposedly going to be taken about some of these things. And he's telling federal workers to get back, and I'm going to get on that here in just a moment. But is anything really changing? Now, I did a little homework about the federal budget. Not that we have one, but I can tell you how much money we're spending. In 2024, the United States government spent $6.9 trillion. If you want to say that was our budget, it was $6.9 trillion. Now, let's break that down and see where, we got a train going by somewhere. Let's break that down and see where those monies were directed. Here we go. Of the almost $7 million, $1.7 trillion of this money, or 24% of the budget, was spent on insurance programs such as Medicare, I'll be in Medicare next year, Medicaid, CHIP, that is the Child's Health Insurance Program, and the ACA, and the Affordable Care Act, and other health insurance subsidies. 21% of this money, or $1.5 trillion, was allocated for Social Security. 13% of this money, pardon me, or $872 billion was spent on the Defense Department, the Pentagon. $526 billion were spent on veterans and federal retirees, and another 7%, or $476 billion, was spent on assorted economic security programs such as the refundable portions of the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Child Tax Credit, or SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. We used to call it food stamps, now it's called SNAP. And low-income housing and things of this nature, and on it goes. But that all comes out to about $7 million was spent in 2024. The remainder of that money was spent on education, infrastructure, roads, bridges, things of that nature, and scientific and medical research. Now get this, 13% of the federal budget was spent to service the debt. The debt. We've got so much debt, as you know. What is it now? $36 trillion in debt. And 13% of that $7 million went just to service the debt, just to make debt payments. So is anything really changing in Washington? In terms of spending, look, the bottom line is this. Everybody knows, and everybody in Washington certainly knows, that we're headed for a crash sooner or later. This is not sustainable. We cannot keep going this way. We cannot keep adding to the deficit at this rate. I know at one point last year, every 100 days, we were adding another $1 trillion. It's almost exponential. I mean, this train is running for the cliff at breakneck speed, and something's got to give, folks. Something has got to give. Now, Trump is doing his best, I believe, to turn the Titanic around. But I don't know if DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is really going to make all that much difference when you look at what Musk is doing as compared to this $7 trillion bill that we pay every year. What am I saying? I'm saying that we have either got to get more revenue coming in, and you don't get that by raising taxes on the evil rich people, by the way, or we're going to have to cut spending, and significantly. It's as simple as that. So this is where we are. I don't know how we can get. Now, Trump thinks we can get more money with tariffs, and maybe he can. It remains to be seen what will happen. But folks, what are you going to do? If you've got $1.7 trillion on insurance programs, Medicaid, Medicare, etc., where are you going to cut? Now, if I were the dictator, I'd have this fixed toot sweet. Believe me, I'd have the biggest pair of scissors you ever saw. 1.5 trillion is Social Security. Where are you going to cut? Here's a little tip for you. You're not going to cut it. Now, I've got a vested interest in Social Security because in 3 years, I turned 67. That's my full retirement age, and I'm eligible. I could collect now, but I'd get penalized for it. But I wouldn't get penalized to collect at age 67. If I wait till 70, I get the maximum benefit from what is an entitlement program. I call Social Security an entitlement program because I am entitled to that money, as all taxpayers are. It's my money. I paid into it, and I want it back. I wish I'd had the option of not going into it in the first place, but of course that's just the way it is. But cutting Social Security doesn't make any sense politically, because let me tell you something, there's no more reliable voting bloc in America than the blue hairs or the no hairs. I would venture to say the federal government, if they did start cutting, I think Social Security is probably the last thing they would cut, because they don't want to piss off the blue hairs. Believe me, that is a reliable voting bloc. And Trump has been quick to say nothing's going to happen with Social Security. And I, in all honesty, I said, well, that's good news. How about the Defense Department? Now, I told you yesterday that Pete Hegseth said he's going to cut the Defense Department, if my math is right, by 40% within 5 years. Well, that will help a great deal, because their budget is almost $900 billion a year. And then you've got all these other programs such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, SNAP, and all of this. Where are you going to cut? Look, if you really start cutting in some of these areas, people are going to start howling, folks. If you cut somebody's welfare benefit, if you end somebody's subsidies, somebody's going to start howling, and everybody in Washington knows it. And I'm just going to be straight with you. If the Republicans came out tomorrow and said they're going to cut every federal department or every federal program, not department would be fine, but if they announce tomorrow they're going to cut every federal program, including the ACA and the Earned Income Tax Credit and SNAP and all these things, if they said they're going to cut them all tomorrow by 20%, the Republicans would be voted out of office en masse in 2 years, and they all know it, and that's why you're not hearing that. That's just where we are. I wish that were not the case, but it is the case, and the Republicans know it. So they're stuck at a rock and a hard place, because there was a time when you used to hear Republican politicians talk about being fiscally responsible. There was a spending bill that came before the Senate the other night. Only one senator opposed it. You can probably guess who it was. That was Rand Paul, the man who has guts and courage of his convictions. Everybody else voted for it. So what is DOGE really changing? I mean, we've got to have some wholesale cuts, or we've got to get some serious cash coming into the federal treasury. Either way, folks, we're headed for a crash. That's the dirty little not so secret. So some cuts are going to have to be made somewhere at some point, or we're just going to reap the whirlwind. It's as simple as that. All right, let me one more thing before I go. What did you do last week on your job? If you have a job, what did you do last week? Is it fair for me to ask you that? What did you do last week? If I employed you, is it fair for me to ask you, as I hand over your paycheck, tell me what you did this week before I give you your paycheck? This is ostensibly what happened with Elon Musk. This is from the Associated Press. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers have been given little more than 48 hours to explain what they accomplished over the last week, sparking confusion across key agencies as Elon Musk expands his drive to slash the size of federal government. Musk telegraphed the extraordinary request last Saturday on his social media network. He said this, quote, consistent with President Trump's instructions, all federal employees will shortly receive an email requesting to understand what they got done last week. Failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. Shortly afterward, unquote, federal employees, including some judges, court staff, and federal prison officials, received a 3-line email from Musk with this instruction. Please reply to this email with approximately 5 bullet points of what you accomplished last week and CC your manager, unquote. Wow. I got to tell you, I'm loving it. Before I give you your paycheck, tell me what you did last week. Is this not a breath of fresh air? To hold federal employees who get their pay from taxpayers, to just simply ask them, what did you do last week? Before I give you your paycheck, what exactly did you do last week? You know, I have been in the corporate world for a number of years, and I once had a job on the staff of a large church in Florida. And I was over it was large enough that it had there were like 3 or 4 clerics in the church on staff, priests, and they had office staff, and then they had various lay people that headed up various departments in this very large church, and I was over one of them. I was over the Department of Outreach and Pastoral Care, and a lot of my job I would have to go and visit with visitors to the church. I'd go into their homes and sit with them and welcome them. I had a lot of hospital outreach. I would go and visit or I would go and visit people that were in the hospital on behalf of the church and just let people know we were thinking about them. It was a big operation, and I was over this one particular department. I had my own office, and you know, that's the way it was. The priest at this church he came from the corporate world. He was a former vice president of a huge firm. His father actually was a federal judge. So he had a real business sense about how to run things, and he was a really good and decent man as well. But every week, every Monday morning, we would always have a staff meeting. And all the department heads and the office staff would go into this staff meeting and meet with the head priest, and he had an assistant priest who was his chief of staff. I mean, it was a well-run operation. And I had all the department heads had to report directly to the chief of staff, who would then report to the head priest of this parish. And so I had to sit down privately with the chief of staff every week, and he would relay via in our one-to-one conversations and via email and inter-office memo. I don't think we even had email back then, but we had inter-office memos that were passed around all the time. And he would sit down with me, and he would basically say, I would basically have to tell him what I did that week and what I was going to do this week. What did you do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Well, I was here with Mr. So-and-so, or I was visiting with Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. This is what I did on Tuesday. This is what I did on Wednesday. This is what I'm doing this week. That's just the way it was. And I never thought anything about it. I mean, some of us might have thought, well, that's a pain in the butt, but you know, that's just how it was. They were holding everybody who was on the staff accountable. They were making sure that you were worthy of your paycheck. And this is not uncommon in the corporate world at all, folks. I've had several jobs in the corporate world. You're always held accountable for what you did, what you're going to do, what you're doing. But the gall that Musk would say to a federal worker who gets his paycheck thanks to the taxpayers, yeah, exactly what did you do last week? Send me an email. Give me 5 bullet points. Let me know. And they are outraged that he would do such a thing. But I'm standing up here applauding it. I think it's wonderful. Justify your job. Tell me why you're working there and what did you do? You know why so many of them are upset? Because they shouldn't have a job in the first place. A lot of these people are these so-called non-essential workers who shouldn't have a job in the first place. Man, I've got so much more to talk about, but I'm a half hour in. That's probably enough time. And there's some people looking at me like I'm some kind of a weirdo. Can you imagine that? Hey, look, thanks for joining me. Make sure you subscribe to the Triple T channel if you have not yet, and comment down below. Let me know your thoughts about what we talked about today. Make sure to give me the old thumbs up. If you would, please, I would appreciate this. Thanks for joining me, everybody. This is Trailer Trash Tim, and I'll see you soon.